Blood stained the horizon as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains, casting long shadows across the barren Nevada desert where Violet Calloway lay crumpled in the dirt, her once fine dress now tattered and her lips cracked from thirst. It was 1876, a year that had begun with promise for 22-year-old Violet. The daughter of a Boston merchant, she had traveled west with a wagon train bound for California, seeking adventure and escape from the stifling expectations of Eastern society. But fate had other plans. Bandits had attacked their wagon train 3 days prior, killing most of the travelers and taking whatever valuables they could find. Violet had been spared death, but not cruelty. The outlaws had dragged her along for days, using her as their servant until they tired of her presence. They had taken everything: her family heirlooms, her small purse of money, even the sturdy boots from her feet. Then they'd tossed her out on the trail like garbage, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a mocking farewell. Good luck making it to the next town, Boston girl. For nearly 2 days, she'd crawled and stumbled along the dusty road, hope dimming with each passing hour. Her stomach had long since stopped growling, moving past hunger to a hollow, burning emptiness that consumed her thoughts. The spring sun beat down mercilessly, and without water, her strength had finally failed her. Now, as darkness approached, Violet curled into herself at the roadside, certain that morning would never come for her. The soft rhythm of hoofbeats drifted through her consciousness, so faint at first that she thought it might be her heart's final, feeble pulses echoing in her ears. But the sound grew steadier, stronger. Violet tried to lift her head to cry out, but her parched throat produced only a rasp. Thomas Jenkins rode his Palomino stallion at an easy pace, returning from a long cattle drive to Carson City. At 28, he'd already established himself as one of the most respected cattlemen in the territory. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, Thomas had the watchful gaze of a man who'd learned to spot trouble before it found him. It was that keen sight that caught the small heap of fabric and limbs on the roadside ahead, barely visible in the fading light. He pulled back on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop, and reached for the rifle in his saddle holster out of habit. Bandits sometimes used such tricks to ambush lone travelers. "Hello there," he called, keeping a safe distance. "You alive?" When no response came, Thomas cautiously dismounted, rifle at the ready. As he approached, he could see it was a woman, her auburn hair matted with dust, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt. He crouched beside her, setting his rifle down, and gently turned her onto her back. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of polished amber, clouded with pain and confusion. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Thomas quickly retrieved his canteen from his saddle and returned to her side. He cradled her head in his lap, carefully tipping a small amount of water to her lips. "Easy now," he cautioned as she tried to gulp it down. "Small sips or you'll make yourself sick." After she had taken a few careful sips, Thomas assessed her condition. Her wrists were raw from bindings, her dress torn at the shoulder, and her feet were bleeding from walking without shoes. The signs of what had happened were clear enough to him. He'd seen the aftermath of bandit attacks before. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, his voice gentle but direct. 3, maybe 4 days, she managed, each word an effort. Thomas nodded grimly and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle containing a small loaf of sourdough bread, the last of his provisions from the trail. Breaking off a piece, he offered it to her. "Eat," he said simply, his eyes holding hers. "Not too fast. Your stomach will need time to remember what food is." Violet's trembling hands reached for the bread, and tears welled in her eyes at the simple kindness. "Thank you," she whispered before taking a small bite. As she ate, Thomas introduced himself. "Thomas Jenkins. Most folks call me Tom. I've got a ranch about 15 miles south of here." "Violet," she replied between careful bites. "Violet Calloway." "Well, Miss Calloway, you're in luck. I was heading home anyway, and I've got a spare bed and a decent cook at the ranch." His tone was matter of fact, but kindness underlined each word. "Think you can hold on to me if I put you up on my horse?" Violet nodded weakly, and Thomas carefully lifted her. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, light as a child. He settled her onto his horse before mounting behind her, keeping one arm securely around her waist. "Rest against me if you need to," he told her as they set off at a gentle pace. "We'll be there before morning." Violet didn't answer. She had already slumped against his chest, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that hope had been restored. Thomas adjusted his hat and guided his horse toward home, wondering what sort of trouble he was bringing back to his peaceful ranch. By the time they arrived at the Jenkins ranch, dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The main house, a sturdy two-story structure built of local pine with a wide front porch, sat nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees. Several outbuildings and corrals spread out around it, and in the distance, cattle dotted the grassland that stretched to the foothills. The front door swung open as they approached, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair wrapped in a braid hurried down the steps. "Thomas Jenkins, I was beginning to worry," she called out, then stopped short at the sight of the woman in his arms. "Good Lord, what's happened?" "Found her abandoned on the trail, Mrs. Whittaker," Thomas explained as he carefully dismounted, still holding the sleeping Violet. "Looks like bandits got her wagon train. She needs food, water, and rest." Mrs. Whittaker Martha, to those who knew her well, had been the Jenkins family housekeeper since Thomas was a boy. After his parents passed 5 years earlier, she had stayed on, running the household with maternal efficiency while Thomas managed the ranch operations. "Bring her inside," Mrs. Whittaker directed, immediately taking charge. "I'll ready the guest room and heat some broth." Thomas carried Violet upstairs to the guest bedroom, a simply furnished but comfortable room with a maple bed frame and a patchwork quilt. Mrs. Whittaker had already turned down the covers, and he laid Violet gently on the bed. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Poor thing's been through hell," Mrs. Whittaker murmured as she removed Violet's torn shoes and began to assess her injuries. "Her feet are in bad shape. I'll need to clean and bandage them." "Do what you can for her," Thomas said, backing toward the door. "I'll have one of the hands ride for doctor Patterson if you think she needs him. Let's see how she fares when she wakes," Mrs. Whittaker replied practically. "Now out with you, I need to get these filthy clothes off her and get her cleaned up." Thomas nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. Despite his exhaustion from the long ride, he found himself restless. He went outside to the porch and lit a cigarette, watching as the sun rose fully over his land. The ranch hands were already moving about their morning chores, and the familiar sounds of cattle lowing and horses nickering filled the air. His foreman, Frank Calloway, approached from the bunkhouse, surprise evident on his weathered face at seeing the boss home earlier than expected. "Welcome back, Tom," Frank greeted him. "Cattle sale go well." "Well enough," Thomas replied, tapping ash from his cigarette. "Got a fair price." Frank nodded toward the house. "Mrs. Whittaker seems in a state, everything all right." Thomas briefly recounted finding Violet on the trail, ending with, "Keep the men alert. If there are bandits working the North Road, they might decide my herd looks tempting." "I'll post extra watches," Frank assured him, "and I'll send Jeb into town for supplies." Mrs. Whittaker mentioned the lady's clothes were beyond saving. Thomas nodded his thanks. Though he employed only 8 ranch hands, each was loyal and capable. The Jenkins ranch wasn't the largest in the territory, but it was well run and prosperous. After finishing his cigarette, Thomas returned inside to find Mrs. Whittaker coming down the stairs with a bundle of tattered clothing. "How is she?" he asked. "Sleeping now, poor lamb. I got her cleaned up and into one of your mother's old nightgowns," the housekeeper replied. "She's thin as a rail and covered in bruises, but nothing seems broken. Those feet will need time to heal, though." Thomas frowned. "Did she say anything more about what happened?" Mrs. Whittaker shook her head. "Barely woke enough to swallow a few spoonfuls of broth. She'll tell us when she's ready." She fixed him with a stern look. "Now, you look dead on your feet yourself. Get some sleep while you can." Thomas couldn't argue with that logic. He headed to his bedroom, removed his dusty trail clothes, and washed quickly at the basin. As he stretched out on his bed, he found himself thinking of the amber-eyed woman now sleeping down the hall. There was something about her, something beyond the natural sympathy her plight evoked. Shaking his head at his own fanciful thoughts, Thomas closed his eyes and was asleep within minutes. Violet woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was she? What new danger awaited? Then fragments of memory returned. A man on horseback, water, bread, the gentle sway of riding through the darkness. She pushed herself up against the pillows, wincing at the soreness that pervaded her body. Looking down, she saw she was wearing a simple cotton nightgown, her feet wrapped in clean bandages. The room around her was modestly furnished but clean and pleasant, with a dresser, washstand, and rocking chair near the window. A soft knock came at the door before it opened to reveal an older woman carrying a tray. "Ah, you're awake," the woman said with a smile. "I'm Mrs. Whitaker, the housekeeper here at the Jenkins Ranch. How are you feeling, my dear?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," Violet admitted, her voice still raspy, "but alive thanks to Mr. Jenkins." Mrs. Whitaker set the tray on the bedside table and helped Violet adjust her pillows. "Thomas has always had good timing. Now, let's get some food into you, just some simple broth and toast to start. Your stomach will need gentle coaxing after going empty so long." As Violet slowly ate, Mrs. Whitaker checked her bandages and explained that she was safe at the Jenkins Ranch, about 30 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Springs. "Mr. Jenkins found me on the road?" Violet asked, piecing together her hazy memories. "Indeed he did, just returning from a cattle sale." "Lucky for you he chose to ride through the night instead of camping." Mrs. Whitaker poured a cup of tea. "He said you mentioned bandits." Violet's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the tea. "Yes, they attacked our wagon train 3 days north of here. Everyone else." "They killed everyone else." Her voice cracked. "They kept me alive to serve them." Mrs. Whitaker's expression softened with understanding. "You don't need to speak of it now, child. You're safe here." "They took everything," Violet continued, needing to explain, "even my boots. When they tired of me, they left me beside the trail. I tried to walk, but—" She glanced down at her bandaged feet. "Well, you'll not be walking anywhere for a while," Mrs. Whitaker said firmly. "Those feet need time to heal. Thomas has sent for some clothes from town for you. Until then, you can borrow some things that belong to his mother." "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose," Violet began. "Nonsense," the housekeeper interrupted. "This ranch has stood empty of female company too long. It'll do Thomas good to remember there's more to life than cattle and horses." She gave Violet an appraising look. "Once you've put some meat back on those bones, you'll be quite the beauty." Violet blushed at the unexpected compliment. She had never considered herself beautiful, merely passable with her auburn hair and unremarkable features. In Boston, she had been overshadowed by more glamorous debutantes, one reason she had been eager to seek a new life out west. "Rest now," Mrs. Whitaker advised, gathering the tray. "The doctor may come by later to check on you, and I expect Thomas will want to speak with you when he wakes." After Mrs. Whitaker left, Violet sank back against the pillows, her mind whirling with questions about her future. She had nothing, no money, no possessions, no family waiting for her. The dream of California seemed impossible now. Where would she go once she healed? What would she do? These troubling thoughts eventually gave way to exhaustion, and she drifted back to sleep, the sound of distant cattle lowing a strange but comforting lullaby. Thomas spent the morning catching up on ranch business with Frank, reviewing the cattle counts and discussing plans for the upcoming spring roundup. By midday, he found himself glancing frequently toward the house, wondering if their guest had awakened. "Go on," Frank finally said with a knowing smile. "I can finish up here." Thomas nodded gratefully and headed back to the main house. He found Mrs. Whitaker in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. She woke earlier, Mrs. Whitaker informed him before he could ask. "Ate a little broth and toast, then went back to sleep. Poor thing's exhausted." "Did she say anything more about what happened?" Thomas asked, helping himself to coffee from the pot on the stove. "Bandits, as you suspected. Attacked her wagon train, killed the others, kept her for a few days, then abandoned her." Mrs. Whitaker's tone was matter-of-fact, but her eyes flashed with anger. "Sounds like those same outlaws that hit the Miller place last month." Thomas frowned. Bandit attacks had become more frequent in the territory over the past year. The local sheriff did what he could, but with limited men and resources, outlaws often escape justice. She's got no one waiting for her, from what I can tell, Mrs. Whitaker continued. No money, no belongings. She can stay here until she's healed, Thomas said firmly. After that, we'll help her get wherever she needs to go. Mrs. Whitaker gave him a measured look. And where might that be? A young woman alone in this territory doesn't have many options. Thomas hadn't considered that problem yet. He knew Cedar Springs had a small boarding house where respectable single women sometimes stayed while working as teachers or shop clerks. Perhaps Violet could find employment there. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, he replied. For now, just make sure she has what she needs. Jeb should be back from town with those clothes by supper time, Mrs. Whitaker said, returning to her bread dough. I sent him to the mercantile with measurements as best I could guess them. Thomas nodded, oddly touched by this practical act of kindness. Thank you, Martha, he said, using her first name as he rarely did. For taking care of her. Mrs. Whitaker's expression softened. She reminds me a bit of your mother when your father first brought her home, all refinement hiding a spine of steel. That girl survived what would have killed most, mark my words. Later that afternoon, Thomas was in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, when he heard Mrs. Whitaker calling for him. He hurried outside to find her on the porch with a small, balding man carrying a black medical bag. Doctor Patterson to see Miss Calloway, Mrs. Whitaker explained. I thought you'd want to hear what he has to say. Thomas greeted the doctor, whom he'd known since childhood, and led him upstairs to the guest room. Mrs. Whitaker knocked gently before opening the door. Violet was awake, propped up against the pillows with a book in her hands, one of his mother's novels that had been left on the bedside table. Her hair had been brushed and braided, and some color had returned to her cheeks. When she saw Thomas, her eyes widened slightly. Mr. Jenkins, she said softly, I haven't had a chance to properly thank you. No need for thanks, Miss Calloway, Thomas replied, suddenly aware of his work-stained clothes and unshaven face. This is Dr. Patterson. He's come to check on you. Thomas stepped back as the doctor approached the bed, but he didn't leave the room. He listened as Dr. Patterson examined Violet, checking her feet, her pulse, and asking questions about her ordeal. You're suffering from exhaustion and mild exposure, the doctor concluded, closing his bag. The cuts on your feet are concerning, but Mrs. Whitaker's treatment is exactly what I would have prescribed. Stay off them for at least a week, then limited walking for another week after that. A week, Violet looked distressed, but I can't impose on Mr. Jenkins for so long. You're not imposing, Thomas said firmly. We have plenty of room and you're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered. Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly. Good, she'll need proper nutrition to regain her strength. Plenty of beef broth, eggs, milk build up to heartier food gradually. After a few more instructions, the doctor prepared to leave. Thomas walked him downstairs and out to his buggy. She's a lucky young woman, Dr. Patterson commented as he climbed into his vehicle. Another night on that trail would have been her last. Thomas nodded soberly. What about her? Other condition was she. He couldn't bring himself to ask directly if she'd been assaulted by the bandits. The doctor understood his concern. I found no evidence of that particular violation, which is somewhat miraculous given the circumstances. However, she has been through a traumatic experience. She'll need time to recover in spirit as well as body. Relief washed through Thomas. At least she had been spared that horror. Thank you for coming out, doctor. Send your bill to the ranch as usual. After the doctor departed, Thomas returned to the barn to finish his chores, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of his unexpected guest. That evening, Violet joined them for supper, wearing a simple blue calico dress that Jeb had purchased in town. Mrs. Whitaker had helped her downstairs, supporting her as she hobbled on her bandaged feet despite the doctor's instructions to stay in bed. I couldn't bear another meal alone in that room, Violet explained when Thomas raised an eyebrow at her appearance in the dining room. Besides, I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness. Thomas helped her into a chair at the oak dining table. There's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same. No, Violet said softly, meeting his eyes. Not anyone. Those bandits were once someone's sons, perhaps even husbands or fathers. Yet they left me to die without a second thought. Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of frontier life. Mrs. Whitaker broke the tension by bringing in a platter of roast beef, potatoes, and spring vegetables. "Eat up now, both of you," she instructed. "Miss Calloway needs to regain her strength, and you, Thomas Jenkins, are getting too lean from all that worrying about cattle prices." The meal progressed pleasantly, with Thomas sharing news from his trip to Carson City and Mrs. Whitaker filling in with local gossip. Violet spoke little, but Thomas noticed how she observed everything with those intelligent amber eyes. "Tell us about yourself, Miss Calloway," Thomas finally asked as Mrs. Whitaker served apple pie for dessert. "Where were you headed before?" "Before the attack," Violet set down her fork. "California. I was traveling with a merchant wagon train. My father was a businessman in Boston, but after he died last year, I found myself with a modest inheritance and no desire to remain in a city full of memories." A shadow crossed her face. "I thought California sounded like a place where a woman might make a fresh start." "No family waiting for you there?" Mrs. Whitaker asked. Violet shook her head. "No family anywhere now. My mother passed when I was 14, and I have no siblings or close relations." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy. He knew what it was to lose parents, though at least he'd had this ranch, his heritage, to sustain him. "What were your plans in California?" he asked. "I had hoped to open a small bookshop," Violet replied, a flicker of animation crossing her face. "I've always loved books, and Father left me enough to purchase a modest inventory. I had it all planned out." Her voice faltered. "Everything was in my trunk on the wagon, my money, my clothes, my books, all gone now." The weight of her loss hung in the air, a dream shattered, a future stolen. "Dreams can be rebuilt," Thomas said quietly. "Different perhaps, but no less worthy." Violet looked up at him, surprise and something like gratitude in her expression. "Perhaps," she agreed, "though at the moment I can't see beyond these walls." "Then don't try to, Mrs. Whitaker advised practically. "One day at a time is enough for now." After supper, Thomas helped Violet to the parlor, where she settled into an armchair near the fireplace. Mrs. Whitaker brought her a cup of tea before excusing herself to the kitchen to finish the evening chores. Thomas hesitated, unsure if Violet would prefer solitude, but she gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Please sit with me a while if you don't mind," she said. "I've had too much silence these past days." Thomas sat, stretching his long legs toward the fire. Outside, the spring evening was turning cool, and the crackling flames cast a warm glow across the simply furnished room. "Your home is lovely," Violet observed, glancing around at the solid furniture and the few personal touches: his mother's piano in the corner, his father's gun cabinet along one wall, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. "It's been in the family since my grandfather came west in '49, Thomas explained. "He was chasing gold like everyone else, but had the sense to invest his modest findings in land instead of gambling and whiskey." "A wise man," Violet commented. "And now you raise cattle." Thomas nodded, surprised by her interest. Most Eastern women he'd encountered had little curiosity about the practical aspects of ranch life. "About 500 head now. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but the land's good and the water rights are secure." "Do you manage it all yourself?" "I have 8 ranch hands, good men all. Frank Holloway's my foreman, been with the ranch since my father's time." Thomas found himself explaining the yearly rhythm of ranch operations: spring calving, summer grazing, fall roundup, winter feeding. Violet listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a quick intelligence. Thomas was surprised to find himself enjoying the conversation. Since his parents' deaths, his social interactions had been limited to business dealings in town, occasional church services, and the companionable but brief exchanges with his ranch hands. "And what about you?" Violet asked after he fell silent. "No wife to share this beautiful home?" Thomas shook his head, suddenly self-conscious. "Never found the time for courting, I suppose. The ranch keeps me busy." It wasn't the whole truth. There had been a girl once, the banker's daughter, in Cedar Springs, but she had made it clear that ranch life was too isolated, too primitive for her tastes. She had married a lawyer from Carson City and moved to a fine house in town. That seems a shame, Violet said softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. A home like this should have children running through it. Before Thomas could respond, Mrs. Whittaker appeared in the doorway. "Time for you to rest, Miss Calloway," she announced. "Doctor's orders." Violet looked reluctant but didn't argue. Thomas helped her up, and with Mrs. Whittaker on her other side, they managed the stairs. At her bedroom door, Violet paused. "Thank you for the evening, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "It's been comforting to have normal conversation again." "Thomas," he corrected. "If you're staying under my roof, you might as well use my given name." A smile touched her lips. "Then you must call me Violet." "Good night, Violet," he said, the name feeling strange yet somehow right on his tongue. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, before disappearing into her room with Mrs. Whittaker. Thomas remained in the hallway for a moment, struck by an odd sensation he couldn't quite identify. Then he shook his head and headed to his own room, reminding himself that Violet Calloway was simply a woman in need of help, not someone who would be staying in his life. The next week passed in a gentle rhythm as Violet regained her strength. True to Dr. Patterson's instructions, she stayed mostly in bed the first few days, with Mrs. Whittaker bringing meals and keeping her company. Thomas would visit briefly each morning and evening, bringing fresh flowers once and a selection of books from the town's small lending library another time. By the fourth day, Violet insisted on coming downstairs despite her still tender feet. She began to help Mrs. Whittaker with simple household tasks, mending linens, polishing silver, and organizing the pantry. The housekeeper initially protested, but soon recognized Violet's need to feel useful rather than a burden. Thomas found himself looking forward to the evenings when the three of them would gather in the parlor after supper. Sometimes he would read aloud from the newspaper or one of the books, his deep voice bringing the words to life. Other times, they simply talked, Violet sharing stories of her life in Boston while Thomas described the changes he'd seen in the territory over the years. On the Sunday following her arrival, Thomas surprised Violet by appearing at breakfast in his best clothes, a dark suit with a crisp white shirt and string tie. "Church in town today," he explained at her questioning look. "I thought you might like to come along if you're feeling up to the buggy ride." Violet hesitated, glancing down at her borrowed dress. "I wouldn't want to embarrass you. I have nothing suitable for church. Jeb brought back another dress from town yesterday, Mrs. Whittaker said, producing a package wrapped in brown paper. Nothing fancy, but clean and proper. Inside was a simple dress of sage green cotton with a matching bonnet. Violet's eyes filled with tears at the thoughtfulness. "I can't accept this," she protested. "You've already done so much." "Consider it an advance on your future," Thomas said firmly. "When you're back on your feet and settled, you can repay me if it eases your mind." Violet nodded, running her fingers over the fabric. "Thank you. I would like to attend services. It's been too long since I've had the comfort of prayer." An hour later, they were in Thomas's buggy, heading toward Cedar Springs. Mrs. Whittaker had declined to join them, claiming she preferred to worship in her own way while preparing Sunday dinner. Violet suspected the older woman was deliberately giving them time alone, a realization that brought a blush to her cheeks. The spring morning was glorious, with wildflowers dotting the grasslands and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage. As they traveled, Thomas pointed out landmarks and neighboring ranches, painting a picture of the community she had inadvertently joined. Cedar Springs proved to be a small but thriving settlement, with a main street lined by wooden buildings, a general store, a hotel, a saloon, the sheriff's office, and a few other businesses. At the end of the street stood the white clapboard church, its small steeple reaching toward the clear blue sky. As Thomas helped Violet down from the buggy, she was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople gathering for the service. A young woman on Thomas Jenkins' arm was evidently a noteworthy sight. "Thomas, good to see you, son," called a portly man approaching with his wife, a thin woman whose sharp eyes assessed Violet immediately. "Judge Porter, Mrs. Porter," Thomas greeted them. "May I introduce Miss Violet Calloway? She's staying at the ranch while recovering from an ordeal on the trail. Violet, Judge Porter is our circuit judge and one of the town founders." "Pleased to meet you, my dear," the judge said kindly. terrible business with those bandits. Sheriff Blackwell mentioned finding what was left of your wagon train. They caught the bandits, Violet asked, hope flaring in her chest. Mrs. Porter shook her head, her mouth pinched. Not yet, though not for lack of trying. Sheriff's been tracking them for months. Miss Calloway is the first survivor we've had, the judge added grimly. Your testimony might be valuable when they're caught. The thought of facing her captors again made Violet's stomach clench, but she nodded. Of course, I want to see justice done. Thomas must have sensed her discomfort, for he gently guided her toward the church steps. We should find seats before the service begins. Inside, the church was simple but welcoming, with polished wooden pews and sunlight streaming through plain glass windows. Thomas led Violet to a pew about halfway down the aisle, nodding to acquaintances as they passed. Throughout the service, Violet was aware of whispers and glances in their direction. By the time the final hymn was sung, she felt drained from the effort of maintaining her composure under such scrutiny. As they exited the church, several people approached to introduce themselves, their curiosity barely masked by expressions of sympathy for her ordeal. Thomas stayed close, his solid presence a comfort as she navigated this impromptu social gauntlet. Thomas Jenkins, you've been holding out on us, declared a buxom woman in a purple dress as she descended upon them. Bringing such a lovely lady to church without any warning, Mrs. Thornton, Thomas said with a patience that suggested long practice. This is Miss Calloway. She's recovering at the ranch after being attacked by bandits on the North Road. Mrs. Thornton's expression shifted from coy to horrified. My dear girl, how dreadful, were you traveling alone? Before Violet could answer, another woman joined them, younger, with blonde curls and a dress that emphasized her narrow waist. Thomas, I was hoping you'd come to services today, the newcomer said, barely acknowledging Violet. Father mentioned you might be interested in that parcel of land adjoining the north pasture. Miss Harrington, Thomas nodded politely. Yes, your father and I discussed it briefly when I was in town last week. Perhaps you'd like to join us for Sunday dinner to discuss it further. Miss Harrington suggested, her smile leaving no doubt that business was not her primary interest. Thomas glanced at Violet, who tried to keep her expression neutral despite an unexpected twinge of something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. Thank you, but I'm afraid I've promised to get Miss Calloway back to the ranch. Mrs. Whittaker is expecting us, and the doctor was quite firm about limiting Miss Calloway's activities while she recovers. Miss Harrington's smile tightened. Another time then. Lovely to meet you, Miss Calloway. I do hope you recover quickly. As they walked back to the buggy, Violet couldn't help asking, Is Miss Harrington a special friend of yours? Thomas helped her up onto the seat before responding. Rebecca Harrington is the banker's daughter. She's been making her interest known for some time, but... He paused, climbing up beside her. But, Violet prompted, surprised by how much his answer mattered to her. But I'm not looking to be any woman's renovation project, Thomas said wryly. Rebecca sees the ranch as something to be improved upon, and me along with it. She'd have me in starched collars every day and hosting dinner parties for visiting dignitaries from Carson City. Violet couldn't help laughing at the image. A fate worse than death for a cattleman, I imagine. Just about, Thomas agreed with a grin. And Violet felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the sight of his smile, a rare but transformative expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and revealed a dimple in his right cheek. They drove back to the ranch in companionable conversation, with Thomas pointing out good grazing land and sharing stories of cattle drives past. By the time they arrived, Violet felt more at ease with him than she had with anyone in recent memory. Mrs. Whittaker had prepared a magnificent Sunday dinner of roast chicken, new potatoes, spring peas, and apple pie for dessert. After they had eaten, Thomas excused himself to check on the pregnant mare in the barn, leaving Violet to help Mrs. Whittaker with the dishes. I saw how the town ladies looked at you too, Mrs. Whittaker remarked as she dried a plate. Especially Rebecca Harrington. That one's had her cap set for Thomas since she came of age. Violet concentrated on the dish she was washing. He seems to have little interest in her. None at all, which only makes her more determined. Mrs. Whittaker gave Violet a sidelong glance. But I haven't seen him look at any woman the way he looks at you in a very long time. Violet nearly dropped the plate. Mrs. Whittaker, surely you're mistaken. Mr. Jenkins Thomas has been very kind, but he sees me as nothing more than someone in need of assistance. The housekeeper snorted. I've known that boy since he was in short pants. He doesn't bring just anyone to church on his arm or spend his evenings reading poetry aloud. Before Violet could formulate a response, the kitchen door opened and Thomas returned. Mare's doing fine, he reported, should foal within the week. He glanced between the two women, sensing he had interrupted something. Everything all right in here, just fine, Mrs. Whittaker assured him. Miss Calloway was telling me about the church service. Violet shot the housekeeper a grateful look for the smooth evasion. Everyone was very welcoming, she said, though it wasn't entirely true. Rebecca Harrington's cool assessment had been anything but welcoming. This town's always hungry for new faces, especially pretty ones, Thomas said, then looked embarrassed, as if he hadn't meant to voice that thought aloud. Violet felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, however casual it might have been. Mrs. Whittaker, meanwhile, wore a knowing smile as she continued drying dishes. That night, as Violet prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the events of the day, the church service, the townspeople's curious gazes, Rebecca Harrington's territorial behavior, and most of all, Thomas's steady presence through it all. She had to admit, at least to herself, that she was developing feelings for her rescuer that went beyond simple gratitude. But what future could there possibly be in such feelings? Once she was healed, she would need to make her own way. Thomas Jenkins had already done far more than could reasonably be expected of a stranger who had found her on the roadside. To imagine he might harbor romantic feelings for her was pure fantasy. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, Violet found herself dreaming of strong hands and storm-gray eyes, and a voice that read poetry as if the words were meant just for her. The days began to take on a pleasant routine as Violet's recovery progressed. By the end of her second week at the Jenkins ranch, she was able to walk without pain, though Mrs. Whittaker still insisted she rest frequently. Thomas had lent her a pair of his mother's old boots, which fit well enough with an extra pair of stockings. One sunny morning, Thomas found Violet on the front porch, a book open in her lap but her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Violet smiled. "I was just admiring the view. It's so different from Boston, wilder, more open." "I can see why people fall in love with this country." Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. "It gets in your blood. My father used to say a man who's known true freedom can never go back to living in a cage." "And women?" Violet asked. "What about their freedom?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Harder one, I'd imagine. But out here, a woman's worth is measured more by her strength and character than by social rules. My mother ran this ranch alongside my father as an equal partner. When he was away on cattle drives, every decision was hers." "She sounds remarkable," Violet said softly. "She was," Thomas agreed. "You remind me of her sometimes, that same quiet determination." The compliment warmed Violet more than she cared to admit. After a moment's hesitation, she asked, "What happened to your parents?" Thomas's expression grew distant. "Influenza, 5 winters ago, took them both within days of each other." He stared out at the mountains. "In some ways, it was a mercy they went together. I can't imagine either of them wanting to live without the other." "You must have loved them very much," Violet said, hearing the pain still evident in his voice. "I did. They taught me everything that matters: how to work hard, how to treat people fairly, how to love this land." He turned to her with a small smile. "What about your parents?" "You mentioned your father was a merchant." Violet nodded. "He imported fine fabrics and exotic goods. Our home was always filled with strange and wonderful things from distant places. Mother was his perfect counterpart, practical, organized, keeping his dreams grounded in reality. And they encouraged your love of books. Father did, especially after Mother died. He let me help in the business, taught me accounting and correspondence." Her voice softened with memory. "He wanted me to have options beyond marriage, to be able to support myself if necessary." "A forward-thinking man," Thomas remarked. Yes, though his brother, my uncle, didn't approve. After father died, Uncle George made it clear he expected me to accept one of my suitors and settle into a proper Boston marriage. Violet's expression hardened. I had other ideas. So you headed west, Thomas concluded. Brave decision for a young woman alone. Or foolish, Violet said with a sigh. Look where it's gotten me, penniless and dependent on the kindness of strangers. Temporary setbacks, Thomas assured her. From what I've seen, you're not the type to stay down for long. Before Violet could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming fast up the drive, and Thomas stood, his posture alert. As the rider drew closer, Violet could see it was a young man, barely more than a boy, his face flushed with exertion. Mr. Jenkins, he called, reining his horse to a stop. Sheriff Blackwell sent me. Those bandits that hit the Miller place and the wagon trains, they've been spotted near Cottonwood Creek. Sheriff's gathering men to go after them. Thomas's expression turned grim. When? Meeting at the sheriff's office in an hour. Sheriff's hoping to ride out by noon. Tell him I'll be there, Thomas said firmly. The young messenger nodded and wheeled his horse around, galloping back toward town. Thomas turned to Violet, whose face had gone pale. The men who attacked your wagon train, this might be our chance to bring them to justice. Violet nodded, her throat tight with sudden fear, not just for herself at the prospect of the bandits being nearby, but for Thomas. You're going with the posse. I have to, Thomas said simply. These men have terrorized the territory for months, if there's a chance to stop them. I understand, Violet whispered, though her heart clenched at the thought of him riding into danger. Thomas strode into the house, calling for Mrs. Whittaker. The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. I heard, she said before Thomas could explain. I'll pack provisions while you get your gear. Thomas nodded gratefully and headed upstairs to prepare. Mrs. Whittaker turned to Violet, who remained on the porch, her book forgotten in her lap. Don't look so worried, child, the housekeeper said, though her own eyes betrayed concern. Thomas is no greenhorn. He served with the cavalry during the war when he was barely more than a boy. He knows how to handle himself. Violet tried to take comfort in this revelation, but her mind was filled with images of Thomas facing the brutal men who had shown her no mercy. Men who had murdered without hesitation and would surely do so again. Half an hour later, Thomas emerged from the house in riding clothes, a gun belt around his waist and a rifle in a scabbard attached to his saddle. One of the ranch hands had saddled his horse and brought it to the front of the house. Mrs. Whittaker handed him a sack of provisions, jerky, hard biscuits, coffee, and a small flask of whiskey. Be careful, she admonished. I'm too old to break in another boss. Thomas smiled at the gruff affection in her voice. I'll be back before you know it. He turned to Violet, who had risen from her chair, her hands clasped tightly before her. Thomas, She faltered, unsure what to say. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes holding hers. Those men need to be stopped, Violet. What they did to you, to the others, they can't be allowed to continue. I know, she said softly. Just come back safely. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. On impulse, Violet reached out and squeezed his hand. Thomas's fingers curled around hers briefly before he released her and mounted his horse. With a final nod to both women, he rode off down the drive toward town. Mrs. Whittaker sighed heavily. Well, that's that. Nothing to do now but wait and pray. Violet nodded, her eyes following Thomas until he disappeared from view. How long do you think they'll be gone? Depends on how far they have to track those outlaws. Could be days. The housekeeper put a comforting hand on Violet's shoulder. Come help me in the kitchen. Keeping busy is the best cure for worry. The next 2 days were the longest of Violet's life. She threw herself into household tasks, helping Mrs. Whittaker with cleaning, cooking, and mending. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, watching the road for any sign of returning riders. Frank Calloway, left in charge of the ranch, stopped by the house regularly with updates on ranch operations and to check if there was any news. On the evening of the second day, he joined Violet on the porch. No sense worrying yourself sick, Miss Calloway, he said kindly. Thomas is the best horseman in the territory and a dead shot with that rifle. Sheriff Blackwell wouldn't let them take unnecessary risks. Violet appreciated his attempt at reassurance. "Have you worked for the Jenkins family long, Mr. Holloway? Going on 15 years now," Frank replied. "Started when Thomas was just a lanky boy learning the business from his father. Watched him grow into one of the finest men I know. He's been very kind to me," Violet said softly. Frank gave her a knowing look. "More than kind, I'd say. Never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you." Violet blushed, startled by this echo of Mrs. Whittaker's observation. "You're mistaken, Mr. Holloway. Mr. Jenkins simply took pity on someone in need." "Believe what you want, Miss Calloway," Frank said with a smile. "But I've known Thomas Jenkins since he was a boy, and I've never seen him ride off to join a posse before. Those bandits weren't a threat to his cattle, they were a threat to you. That's why he went." Before Violet could formulate a response, a distant movement on the road caught her attention. Riders were approaching a group of them, moving slowly in the fading light. Frank stood, shading his eyes. That'll be them returning. Violet's heart raced as she scanned the group, desperately searching for Thomas's familiar figure. The riders drew closer, and she counted 5, 6, 7 men. Thomas had said the posse numbered 10. "Something's wrong," Frank muttered, clearly doing the same calculation. He hurried down the steps toward the approaching riders. Violet followed more slowly, fear making her legs unsteady. As the group reached the ranch yard, she could finally make out individual faces. Sheriff Blackwell led the group, his expression grim. Behind him rode several men she recognized from church, all looking exhausted and dirty. And then near the back she saw him, Thomas, slumped slightly in his saddle, his shirt stained with blood. Violet's heart stopped. She rushed forward as Frank helped Thomas dismount, supporting him when his legs nearly gave way. "It's not as bad as it looks," Thomas said, his voice weak but determined. "Bullet just grazed my side." "Grazed, hell," the sheriff growled. "That slug dug a furrow 2 inches long in your ribs. You need that properly dressed." Mrs. Whittaker had appeared from the house, already issuing orders. "Bring him inside. Frank, send one of the boys for Dr. Patterson. Sheriff, you and your men are welcome to water your horses and rest a spell." While the other men headed for the well and hitching posts, Frank and another ranch hand helped Thomas into the house. Violet followed, her heart in her throat. In the parlor, they eased Thomas onto the sofa. Mrs. Whittaker quickly arrived with clean cloths, a basin of water, and her medicine box. "Let me see the damage," she demanded, gently pulling aside Thomas's bloodied shirt. Violet gasped at the angry wound across his ribs, a deep furrow that still oozed blood despite the crude bandage someone had applied in the field. "Miss Calloway, fetch the whiskey from the cabinet, Mrs. Whittaker instructed. "Frank, I'll need hot water from the kitchen." As the others hurried to comply, Mrs. Whittaker began cutting away Thomas's shirt. "Foolish man," she muttered, "always had more courage than sense." "We got them, Martha," Thomas said, wincing as she probed the wound. "All 6 of the gang. Won't be terrorizing any more travelers." "At what cost?" the housekeeper retorted. "Nearly getting yourself killed." Violet returned with the whiskey and handed it to Mrs. Whittaker, who took a generous swallow before pouring some onto a cloth. "This will hurt," she warned Thomas, then pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to his wound. Thomas hissed in pain but didn't cry out. His eyes found Violet's, and despite his obvious discomfort, he attempted a reassuring smile. "Don't look so worried," he told her. "I've had worse shaving." "Hush now," Mrs. Whittaker scolded, though there was relief behind her stern expression. "Miss Calloway, hold this clean cloth firmly against the wound while I prepare a proper bandage." Violet took Mrs. Whittaker's place beside Thomas, pressing the cloth gently but firmly against his side. She was acutely aware of the heat of his skin beneath her fingers, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the clean masculine scent of him beneath the dust and blood of the trail. "I was afraid," she admitted in a low voice, meant only for him. "When I saw you riding in, covered in blood." Thomas's hand came up to cover hers where it pressed against his wound. "I promised I'd come back," he said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Mrs. Whittaker returned with proper bandages, and Violet reluctantly withdrew her hand, while Mrs. Whitaker dressed Thomas's wound. Sheriff Blackwell appeared in the doorway. "Doc's on his way," he announced. "Should be here within the hour." "Thank you, Sheriff," Violet said. "Would you like some coffee while you wait? I'm sure you and your men could use it." The sheriff nodded gratefully, and Violet hurried to the kitchen to prepare coffee and whatever food she could quickly assemble for the hungry posse. As she worked, she overheard the sheriff describing the confrontation with the bandits to Frank. Caught up to them near Cottonwood Creek, holed up in an old line shack, they weren't about to surrender peacefully. The sheriff's voice was grim. "Thomas took that bullet covering my position. Damn fool nearly got himself killed, but he dropped the outlaw who was fixing to put a bullet in my back." Violet's hands trembled as she poured coffee into mugs. The danger had been even greater than she'd feared. Thomas could have been killed if the bullet had struck a few inches to the left. When she returned to the parlor with a tray of coffee and cold biscuits with jam, the sheriff was questioning Thomas about the outlaws. "You're sure the one you shot was Reeves?" "The leader," Thomas nodded, wincing at the movement. "Same scar across his cheek that Miss Calloway described." "Same silver-plated pistols, too." The sheriff turned to Violet. "Miss Calloway, I hate to trouble you when you're still recovering yourself, but would you be willing to look at some items we recovered from the outlaws? See if you recognize anything that might have been taken from your wagon train." Violet hesitated, the prospect of confronting physical reminders of her ordeal unsettling her. But Thomas's encouraging look gave her courage. "Of course, Sheriff," she agreed. "Whatever helps bring justice." "I'll have one of my deputies bring the recovered items by tomorrow," Sheriff Blackwell said. "For now, I'd best get my men back to town. Those outlaws won't be troubling anyone again, but there's paperwork to be done." After the sheriff and his men departed, Dr. Patterson arrived to properly treat Thomas's wound. He confirmed Mrs. Whitaker's assessment. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across Thomas's ribs, but hadn't penetrated his chest. "You're a lucky man, Jenkins," the doctor said, as he finished applying a fresh bandage. "An inch deeper and we'd be digging a grave instead of patching you up." "Always had more luck than sense," Thomas replied with a pained smile, echoing Mrs. Whitaker's earlier criticism. "Bed rest for at least 3 days," Dr. Patterson instructed firmly. "Then light duties only for another week. That wound needs time to heal clean." After the doctor left, Mrs. Whitaker and Violet helped Thomas upstairs to his bedroom. As they settled him on his bed, Mrs. Whitaker shook her head. "Now I've got 2 invalids to care for," she grumbled, though her tone held more relief than annoyance. "I'm hardly an invalid anymore," Violet protested. "In fact, I can help care for Thomas while he recovers." Mrs. Whitaker gave her an appraising look. "That might be for the best. I've got the household to run, and Frank will need guidance on ranch matters." She turned to Thomas. "You be a good patient for Miss Calloway, you hear? No getting up until I say so." Thomas nodded wearily, the pain and exhaustion finally catching up to him. As Mrs. Whitaker left to prepare a light supper, Violet lingered at Thomas's bedside. "Thank you," she said softly, "for going after them. For risking your life to bring them to justice." Thomas reached for her hand, his grip weak but warm. "I couldn't let them hurt anyone else the way they hurt you." Violet felt tears prick her eyes at the simple declaration. On impulse, she leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Rest now," she whispered. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." Thomas's eyes were already closing, but a slight smile curved his lips at her touch. Violet watched him for a moment, her heart full of emotions she wasn't quite ready to name before quietly leaving the room. That night, as Violet lay in her own bed, she reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed in just over 2 weeks. From the brink of death on a dusty trail to finding herself caring deeply for a man she barely knew, it seemed impossible, yet undeniably real. The bandits who had destroyed her future were gone, but what lay ahead remained uncertain. All she knew was that the thought of leaving the Jenkins ranch, leaving Thomas, filled her with a hollow ache that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. With a sigh, Violet turned onto her side and tried to sleep, telling herself that tomorrow would be soon enough to worry about the future. The roles had reversed. Now it was Violet who brought Thomas broth and bread, who read aloud to pass the long hours of convalescence, who changed bandages with gentle hands. Thomas proved to be an impatient patient, chafing at the restrictions Dr. Patterson had placed on him. By the second day, he was insisting he could at least review the ranch accounts from his bed. "Frank's a good man, but he's no bookkeeper," Thomas argued when Violet tried to make him rest. "The spring calf count needs to be recorded, supply orders placed for summer, and all of it can wait another day," Violet interrupted firmly. Doctor's orders were clear: rest for 3 days. Thomas scowled, looking so much like a thwarted child that Violet had to suppress a laugh. "I'm not used to lying about while others do my work. Consider it a new experience," Violet suggested, settling into the chair beside his bed with a book. "Now, shall I continue with this story, or would you prefer to sulk some more?" Thomas's scowl melted into reluctant amusement. "You're a hard woman, Violet Calloway." "I prefer determined," she replied primly, opening the book to where they had left off the previous evening. As she read, Violet was aware of Thomas watching her rather than staring at the ceiling as he had during yesterday's reading session. The intensity of his gaze made her voice falter occasionally, and she found herself wondering what thoughts were passing behind those storm-gray eyes. After about half an hour, a knock at the door interrupted the reading. Mrs. Whitaker entered, followed by Sheriff Blackwell and a young deputy carrying a small wooden crate. "Sheriff's here with those items he mentioned," Mrs. Whitaker announced. "I told him you were both up here." Thomas pushed himself to a sitting position, wincing slightly at the movement. "Sheriff Deputy Wilson, come in." The lawman nodded a greeting, the deputy setting the crate on a small table near the window. "How's that wound, Jenkins?" Sheriff Blackwell asked. "Healing," Thomas replied. "I'd be up and about if my womenfolk weren't so tyrannical." Violet shot him a reproving look, which he answered with an unrepentant grin. The sheriff turned to Violet. "Miss Calloway, these are the personal effects we recovered from the outlaws' camp. I was hoping you might identify anything that belonged to you or your fellow travelers." Violet approached the crate with trepidation. The sheriff removed the lid, revealing an assortment of items: watches, jewelry, small weapons, a few books, and some papers. With trembling fingers, Violet sifted through the contents. Most were unfamiliar, likely taken from other victims. Then her breath caught as she lifted a small leather-bound volume. "This was mine," she said softly, running her fingers over the embossed cover of Wordsworth's poems. "It was a gift from my father." She continued searching, finding a cameo brooch that had belonged to the wagon master's wife and a pocket watch she recognized as belonging to Mr. Simmons, an elderly gentleman who had joined their wagon train in St. Louis. At the bottom of the crate, a folded document caught her eye. Opening it carefully, she gasped. "My bank draft," she exclaimed. "From the Bank of Boston to the First Bank of San Francisco." Her hands trembled as she held the paper. "I thought it was lost forever." "How much is it for?" Thomas asked, his expression unreadable. Violet swallowed hard before answering. $5,000, my entire inheritance." The sheriff whistled softly. "That's a substantial sum, Miss Calloway. Those bandits probably didn't realize what they had likely couldn't read well enough to understand its value. Is it still valid?" Thomas asked. The sheriff nodded. "Should be. It's not like currency that can be spent by anyone. You'd need to prove your identity at the bank, but as the named recipient, that money is still yours." Violet sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. With her inheritance restored, she could continue to California as planned. She could open her bookshop, build the independent life she had dreamed of. So why did the prospect suddenly fill her with more dread than joy? "There's more," the deputy said, reaching into his pocket. "Found these on Reeves himself." He held out a small velvet pouch. Violet took it and carefully emptied the contents into her palm. There lay her mother's wedding ring and a pair of pearl earrings, the only jewelry she had brought with her on the journey west. Tears filled her eyes at the sight. "I never thought I'd see these again," she whispered. "Thank you, Sheriff." Sheriff Blackwell nodded, clearly pleased to have restored at least some of what had been taken from her. "We'll keep looking through their belongings. Might find more items from your wagon train." After the lawman departed, Violet sat quietly, the bank draft in one hand and her mother's ring in the other. Mrs. Whitaker had left as well, heading downstairs to prepare lunch. "You can go to California now," Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice was carefully neutral. "Open your bookshop as you planned." Violet looked up at him, suddenly aware of the distance that had opened between them with the recovery of her funds, a distance measured not in feet but in diverging futures. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I suppose I could." Neither spoke for a long moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Thomas shifted slightly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Would you mind opening the window? It's getting stuffy in here." Grateful for the distraction, Violet moved to the window and pushed it open, letting in the fresh spring air. Outside, ranch hands were moving cattle from one pasture to another, their distant calls creating a comforting backdrop of normalcy. "You've built something wonderful here," Violet said, her back still to Thomas as she gazed out at the ranch. "A life to be proud of." "It's not always easy," Thomas replied. "The winters are harsh, the work never ending. Cattle prices rise and fall at the whim of markets thousands of miles away." "But it's yours," Violet said, turning to face him. "You belong to this land and it belongs to you." Thomas studied her for a moment before asking, "And where do you belong, Violet?" It was the question that had been circling in her mind since the sheriff had handed her back her future. Where did she belong? In a California town she'd never seen, in a bookshop that existed only in her dreams, or here, in this place that had begun to feel more like home than anywhere since her father's death. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "For so long, California represented freedom to me, a place where I could be more than someone's daughter or wife. But now," Thomas prompted when she trailed off. Violet met his gaze directly. "Now I wonder if freedom isn't as much about who you're with as where you are." A flicker of something hope perhaps crossed Thomas's face before he carefully schooled his expression. "You should take time to decide. Your recovery, the shock of the attack, finding your inheritance, it's a lot to process." Violet nodded, knowing he was right but feeling a twinge of disappointment at his measured response. Had she misinterpreted the connection between them? Was it merely kindness and not the deeper emotion she had begun to hope for? "I should let you rest," she said, moving toward the door. "Mrs. Whitaker will bring up your lunch soon." "Violet," Thomas called as she reached the doorway. When she turned back, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever you decide, I'm glad those outlaws didn't steal your future along with everything else." It wasn't a declaration of feelings, not quite, but something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, gave Violet hope that perhaps she wasn't alone in what she was beginning to feel. "So am I," she replied softly before leaving the room. That evening, Violet sat alone on the porch, watching as twilight descended on the ranch. The bank draft and her mother's ring rested in her palm as she contemplated her future. California beckoned with its promise of a fresh start, a business of her own, independence. But the thought of leaving the Jenkins ranch, leaving Thomas, created an ache in her chest that no amount of rationalization could ease. In just over 2 weeks, she had come to care for this place and its people. Mrs. Whitaker with her gruff affection, Frank and the other ranch hands with their respectful nods and kind words, and Thomas. Thomas, who had saved her life with bread and water on a dusty trail, who had risked his life to bring her attackers to justice, who read poetry with surprising sensitivity, and looked at her, sometimes as if she were a miracle he never expected to find. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Whitaker emerged, carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. "Thought you might like some company," the housekeeper said, handing Violet one of the cups before settling into the chair beside her. "Beautiful evening." "It is," Violet agreed, grateful for the companionship. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea and watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I found my inheritance," Violet finally said, opening her hand to reveal the bank draft. Among the items the sheriff recovered from the outlaws, Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's something. A sign from Providence, perhaps." "A sign of what?" Violet asked, genuinely curious about the older woman's perspective. "That your path is yours to choose," Mrs. Whitaker replied. "Not forced upon you by circumstance," Violet considered this. I always planned to go to California to open a bookshop. It was my dream since before father died. Dreams can change, Mrs. Whittaker observed, or new ones can take root alongside the old. Violet twisted her mother's ring between her fingers. I've come to care for this place, for the people here. For Thomas, Mrs. Whittaker added softly, making it a statement rather than a question. Violet nodded, not bothering to deny what must be obvious to the perceptive housekeeper. But I don't know if he feels the same. He's been kind, certainly, but kindness isn't love. Mrs. Whittaker set down her teacup with a decisive click. That boy has been half in love with you since he carried you through the front door. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, it's the same way his father used to look at his mother. Then why hasn't he said anything? Violet asked, her heart quickening at Mrs. Whittaker's words. Because he's a Jenkins man, and they're as stubborn as they are honorable, the housekeeper replied with exasperated affection. He won't speak until he's sure of your feelings, and even then, he'll hold back if he thinks you might have a better future elsewhere. Violet pondered this insight, recognizing its truth. Thomas would put what he perceived as her best interests above his own desires. It was the same impulse that had sent him riding with the posse, protecting others, even at risk to himself. What should I do? Violet asked softly. Mrs. Whittaker patted her hand. Only you can answer that, child. But if you're asking my opinion, I think you'd make a fine mistress for this ranch. Heaven knows it needs a woman's touch, and Thomas needs someone who sees him for who he is, not for what they wish him to be. With that, the housekeeper rose and collected their empty cups. Don't stay out too late. The night air still has a spring chill to it. After Mrs. Whittaker returned inside, Violet remained on the porch, turning possibilities over in her mind. Could she give up her California dream for a new one here? Or perhaps she could have elements of both. An idea began to form, tentative at first, then taking firmer shape as she considered it from different angles. By the time she finally rose and went inside, Violet had made her decision. Now she just needed to find the courage to act on it. The following morning, Thomas was finally allowed out of bed, though under strict orders to avoid any strenuous activity. Violet found him in his study, reviewing ranch accounts with Frank. "Am I interrupting?" she asked from the doorway. Both men looked up, Frank with a polite nod and Thomas with a smile that warmed his entire face. "Not at all," Thomas assured her. "Frank was just updating me on the spring calf count. Highest we've had in years," Frank added. "Good strong stock, will fetch top prices at the fall market." Violet stepped into the room, suddenly nervous about what she had come to say. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Thomas privately, if you don't mind." Frank rose immediately, giving Thomas a look that Violet couldn't quite interpret. "I should check on that north fence line anyway." The hands reported some damage after yesterday's windstorm. After Frank departed, closing the door behind him, Thomas gestured to the chair the foreman had vacated. "Everything all right? You look concerned." Violet sat, smoothing her skirt as she gathered her courage. "I've been thinking about my future," she began. "About what to do now that my inheritance has been recovered." Thomas's expression became carefully neutral. "I see. Have you made a decision?" "I have," Violet confirmed. "But first I need to ask you something." She took a deep breath. "Cedar Springs doesn't have a bookshop, does it?" Confusion crossed Thomas's face at this unexpected question. "No. The general store carries a few popular novels and school primers, but nothing extensive. Most folks order books from Carson City if they want something specific." Violet nodded, having suspected as much from her brief visit to the town. "And the nearest proper bookstore would be in Carson City." "Yes, about 60 miles east." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Violet, where are you going with this?" "I'm wondering if there might be a place for a small bookshop in Cedar Springs," she said, watching his reaction closely. "Perhaps combined with a lending library. Somewhere children could get school books, ranchers could order agricultural journals, ladies could find novels and poetry." Understanding began to dawn in Thomas's eyes. "You're thinking of staying, opening your bookshop here instead of California, if there would be enough business to support it," Violet said. "And if I had reason to stay." Thomas was silent for a moment, and Violet's heart pounded in her chest. Had she been too subtle? Should she have been more direct about her feelings? Cedar Springs is growing, Thomas finally said, his voice measured. The railroad spur line will reach us by next year. A bookshop might do well, especially with the school expanding. He was still talking about business, not about them, not about what she had tried to imply with her last statement. Disappointment washed through Violet. Then I'll consider it, she said, rising from her chair. Thank you for your insight. As she turned to leave, Thomas suddenly stood, wincing at the quick movement. Violet, wait. His voice was urgent, all careful neutrality gone. Is that the only reason you're considering staying, the business opportunity? Violet turned back to face him, finding him much closer than she expected. His eyes searched hers, hope warring with uncertainty in their gray depths. No, she admitted softly, it's not the only reason. What else? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gathering all her courage, Violet reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. You, she said simply. I've come to care for you, Thomas, more than I thought possible in such a short time. For a heartbeat, Thomas remained perfectly still. Then his hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. Violet, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. I've been half afraid to hope. You're educated, cultured, you could have a far more refined life than anything I can offer here. I don't want refined, Violet told him, stepping closer. I want real, I want this land, this life. She paused, gathering her courage. I want you if you want me. Thomas's free arm slipped around her waist, drawing her gently against him. I've wanted you since I found you on that trail, he confessed. Not just because you needed saving, but because of the courage I saw in you even then. Every day since, I've discovered more reasons to admire you, to care for you. Violet's heart soared at his words. Then why didn't you say anything? Because you had just survived a terrible ordeal, Thomas explained. Because you were dependent on my hospitality. Because I didn't want you to feel obligated or confused about your own feelings. His expression grew earnest. And because I thought you were bound for California as soon as you recovered. California was a dream, Violet said softly. But sometimes new dreams replace the old, better dreams built on something real. Thomas's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. Are you sure, Violet, really sure? I don't want you to have regrets. In answer, Violet rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Thomas pulled her closer, his hand cradling the back of her head. When they finally parted, both were breathless. I'm sure, Violet whispered against his lips, more sure than I've ever been of anything. Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I love you, he said softly. I think I've loved you since the moment you accepted that bread from my hands. And I've loved you since you risked your life to bring my attackers to justice, Violet replied, joy bubbling through her at finally being able to speak the words aloud. Thomas kissed her again, more thoroughly this time, until a sharp pain from his wound made him wince and pull back slightly. We should probably be careful of your injury, Violet suggested with a smile. Worth it, Thomas assured her, though he did loosen his hold a little. Violet, if you stay, if we build a life together, I want you to know that your bookshop dream matters to me. I'll help you make it happen here. This doesn't have to be an either or choice. Violet's heart swelled at his understanding. That means more than you know. I want both a life with you and a purpose of my own. Then that's what we'll build, Thomas promised, together. A knock at the study door interrupted them, and they reluctantly stepped apart as Mrs. Whittaker entered. The housekeeper took one look at their flushed faces and smiled knowingly. I see you two have finally come to an understanding, she observed dryly. About time, if you ask me. Thomas laughed, the sound joyous and unrestrained. Martha, you're impossible, just practical, Mrs. Whittaker corrected. Now, if you're quite finished mooning over each other, lunch is ready. And Thomas Jenkins, you'd better have been taking it easy on those ribs or I'll have something to say about it. As they followed Mrs. Whittaker to the dining room, Thomas took Violet's hand in his, lacing their fingers together. She'll be insufferably smug now, he murmured. She's been dropping hints about you since your first week here. She's not the only one, Violet confided. Frank made similar comments. Thomas shook his head in mock dismay. Surrounded by matchmakers, we never stood a chance. Violet squeezed his hand, happiness filling her completely. I wouldn't have it any other way. 2 months later, on a perfect June morning, Violet Calloway became Violet Jenkins in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Springs Church. The entire town turned out for the event, along with ranchers from miles around. Even Rebecca Harrington attended, though her smile seemed somewhat forced as she congratulated the couple. Violet wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Whitaker had helped her select on a shopping trip to Carson City. In her auburn hair, she wore a circlet of wildflowers gathered from the Jenkins ranch that morning. Thomas, handsome in a new black suit, couldn't take his eyes off his bride as they spoke their vows before Reverend Taylor. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the Jenkins ranch, where tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees. Mrs. Whitaker had outdone herself with the wedding feast, and ranch hands had constructed a wooden platform for dancing. As the afternoon progressed, Violet found a moment to slip away from the festivities. She made her way to the front porch, seeking a brief respite from the well-wishers and congratulations. From this vantage point, she could see the entire celebration spread out before her, the musicians playing, children chasing each other between tables. Thomas deep, in conversation with Sheriff Blackwell and Judge Porter. The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of preparations not just for the wedding, but for Violet's bookshop as well. Thomas had purchased a small building on Cedar Springs Main Street, and renovations were nearly complete. Violet had already placed orders for inventory, using part of her recovered inheritance to create the carefully curated collection she had always dreamed of. There you are. Violet turned to find Thomas approaching, a smile lighting his face. Just catching my breath, she explained as he joined her at the porch railing. It's a bit overwhelming. Thomas slipped an arm around her waist. Having second thoughts, Mrs. Jenkins, the name sent a thrill through Violet. Not a single one, Mr. Jenkins. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching their guests. From the edge of the gathering, Mrs. Whitaker caught Violet's eye and gave an approving nod before turning back to direct the servants bringing out more food. She's already planning how to redecorate the house, Thomas said with a chuckle. I heard her telling Judge Porter's wife that the parlor curtains have been a disgrace for years. Violet laughed. She's given me a list of improvements a mile long. I think she's been waiting for a mistress of the house to implement them. Well, she couldn't have chosen a better one, Thomas said, turning to face Violet fully. Are you happy, truly? Violet reached up to straighten his string tie. Happier than I ever imagined possible. I have you. The bookshop will open next month in this place. She gestured toward the ranch spreading out around them. It already feels like home. Thomas kissed her gently. It is home, our home. A shout from the celebration drew their attention. It was time for the wedding dance. Thomas offered Violet his arm with a formal bow that made her laugh. May I have this dance, Mrs. Jenkins? You may have every dance, Mr. Jenkins, Violet replied, taking his arm, for the rest of our lives. As they rejoined their guests and moved onto the dance floor, Violet thought back to that desperate day on the dusty trail, when all hope had seemed lost. How could she have known that the stranger offering bread to a starving woman would become the love of her life? That the simple act of kindness would lead to this moment of perfect happiness? Thomas held her close as they danced, his eyes never leaving hers. What are you thinking? He asked. About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us exactly where we're meant to be, Violet replied. If those bandits hadn't attacked my wagon train, I would never have met you. Then I'll be forever grateful for whatever twist of fate brought you to that roadside, Thomas said, his voice husky with emotion, though I wish it could have happened without your suffering. It brought me to you, Violet said simply. That makes it worthwhile. As the sun began to set over the Jenkins ranch, casting golden light across the celebration, Violet looked around at the life she had found in this unexpected place. Not the California dream she had planned, but something better, something real and true and lasting. Thomas pulled her closer as the music slowed. Welcome home, Violet, he whispered against her hair. And in his arms, with the ranch spreading out around them and their future stretching bright before them, Violet knew she was exactly where she belonged. 5 years later, on another perfect June day, Violet sat on the front porch of the Jenkins ranch house, watching as Thomas gave their 3-year-old son Timothy his first riding lesson on an ancient, gentle pony. Beside her in a bassinet, 2-month-old Alina slept peacefully, her tiny fists occasionally waving in her dreams. "Keep your back straight, Timmy," Thomas called, his hand steady on the lead rein as the pony plodded around the corral. "That's it." The boy's face was a study in concentration, his features a perfect blend of his parents' Thomas's gray eyes and Violet's auburn hair. His small hands clutched the saddle horn with determination as he bobbed along with the pony's gait. "Mama, look." He called excitedly when he caught sight of Violet watching. "I'm riding." "I see you, sweetheart," Violet called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Mrs. Whittaker emerged from the house with a tray of lemonade and settled into the rocking chair beside Violet. Though her hair was now completely silver and her movements a bit slower, she remained the backbone of the household, especially since Alina's birth had temporarily limited Violet's activities. "That boy's a born horseman, just like his father," Mrs. Whittaker observed with satisfaction. "And Frank says he's already asking questions about the cattle that would stump a grown man." Violet smiled, watching as Thomas lifted Timmy down from the pony after their lesson, the boy chattering excitedly as they walked hand in hand toward the house. "He wants to be just like his papa. Yesterday he informed me very seriously that he needs to start learning how to run the ranch because someday it will be his responsibility." Mrs. Whittaker chuckled. "Big words for such a little one." "He gets that from his mother," Thomas said as he and Timmy reached the porch. "Always with her nose in a book." Violet raised an eyebrow. "I seem to recall finding you reading poetry to Alina last night, Mr. Jenkins, something about wanting her to appreciate the finer things in life." Thomas had the grace to look sheepish as he accepted a glass of lemonade from Mrs. Whittaker. "A man can't have his daughter growing up uncultured." "Mama, can I go help Frank now?" Timmy asked, bouncing on his toes after gulping down his lemonade. "He said I could watch him fix the gate." Violet exchanged a glance with Thomas, who nodded. "Be careful and do exactly as Mr. Calloway tells you," she instructed. With a whoop of joy, Timmy dashed off toward the barn where Frank was working. Thomas sank into the chair on Violet's other side, reaching over to gently stroke Alina's downy head. "How's our little lady today?" he asked. "Perfect," Violet replied. "She ate well and has been sleeping for nearly 2 hours." Thomas smiled, the expression softening his weather-worn face. After 5 years of marriage, Violet still found her breath catching sometimes when he looked at her or their children with such open love. "And how is her mother?" Thomas asked, his eyes assessing Violet with gentle concern. Alina's birth had been difficult, and Dr. Patterson had insisted on a longer recovery period than after Timmy's arrival. "Better every day," Violet assured him, reaching for his hand. "Doctor Patterson says I can return to the bookshop for a few hours each morning starting next week, as long as I bring Alina with me and don't overdo it." The Cedar Springs Bookshop and Lending Library had become a thriving business, even more successful than Violet had initially hoped. What had begun as a small shop had expanded to include a reading room where the town's children gathered for weekly story hours, and a section dedicated to scientific and agricultural journals that drew ranchers from miles around. Violet had hired an assistant, Mary Patterson, the minister's daughter, to help run the shop, but she still preferred to manage the ordering and special requests herself. During her confinement, before Alina's birth, and the recovery period after, she had sorely missed her daily interactions with customers and the satisfaction of matching readers with just the right books. "Mrs. Lewis was asking when you'd be back," Thomas said, referring to the schoolteacher who had become one of the bookshop's most loyal patrons. "She says Mary tries her best, but she doesn't have your knack for finding exactly the right book for her students." Violet smiled, pleased by the compliment. "Tell her I'll be in next Tuesday morning. I have several new titles for her classroom library that arrived last week." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching buggy. Thomas stood, shading his eyes to see who was coming. "It's Judge and Mrs. Porter," he announced, moving to the porch steps to greet their visitors. The Porters were frequent guests at the Jenkins ranch, the judge having developed a fatherly affection for both Thomas and Violet over the years. As Mrs. Porter climbed down from the buggy, Violet could see she carried a wrapped package. "We've come to see that new baby girl," Mrs. Porter announced as she mounted the porch steps, "and to bring her a proper christening gift." "You're just in time," Violet said warmly. "She'll be waking for her feeding any minute now." As if on cue, Eleanor stirred in her bassinet, her tiny face scrunching up before her eyes blinked open. Violet lifted her daughter into her arms, marveling yet again at the perfect tiny fingers and the wisp of dark hair that suggested Eleanor might favor Thomas in coloring. Mrs. Porter cooed appropriately over the baby, while the judge and Thomas discussed recent developments in the territory. Talk of statehood was growing more serious, and new settlers arrived almost weekly now that the railroad provided easier access. "The town council has approved funding for a proper schoolhouse," Judge Porter informed them. "No more classes in the back room of the church. They're hoping to have it built before winter." "That's wonderful news," Violet said. "Perhaps we should expand the children's section of the bookshop to accommodate the growing student population." Thomas smiled at her enthusiasm, always thinking like a businesswoman. "I learned from the best," Violet replied, referring to both her father and to Thomas, who had supported and advised her as she established her shop. The conversation flowed easily as Mrs. Whittaker served refreshments, and Timmy eventually returned from his adventures with Frank, proudly displaying a small wooden horse the foreman had carved for him. As twilight approached, the Porters prepared to leave. Mrs. Porter pressed the package into Violet's hands. "Open it before we go," she urged. "I want to see if you like it." Violet handed Eleanor to Thomas and carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a beautifully bound family Bible, its leather cover embossed with the Jenkins name in gold lettering. "It's traditional, Mrs. Porter explained, a touch anxiously. "For recording births, marriages, deaths, I noticed you didn't have one when we visited after Timothy was born." "It's perfect," Violet said sincerely, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "We'll treasure it." After the Porters departed, Violet and Thomas sat in the gathering darkness, watching as the first stars appeared in the clear sky. Eleanor had been fed and was now sleeping against Thomas's shoulder, while Timmy had reluctantly gone inside with Mrs. Whittaker for his bath and bedtime story. "Happy?" Thomas asked softly, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding day. Violet looked at her husband, at the child in his arms, at the home they had built together, and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "Completely," she answered. "You know, I used to dream about California, the excitement of a new place, the adventure of starting fresh somewhere no one knew me. Any regrets about staying here instead?" Thomas asked, a question he hadn't posed in years. Violet shook her head firmly. "Not a single one. This is where I was meant to be, where we were meant to be." She reached over to stroke Eleanor's cheek. "Sometimes I think about that day on the trail, how close I came to never experiencing any of this, if you hadn't come along when you did." "But I did," Thomas said, taking her hand in his. "And you're here, safe and loved. Our children are healthy, the ranch is thriving, and your bookshop is the pride of Cedar Springs. And to think it all started with a simple act of kindness," Violet mused. "Bread offered to a starving stranger." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips. "The best decision I ever made, stopping on that road." As night settled fully over the Jenkins ranch, Violet leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and gave thanks once again for the twist of fate that had brought her to this place, this life, this love. From the depths of despair on a dusty trail to the heights of joy on this peaceful porch, it had been a journey she could never have imagined, but one she would forever cherish. "I love you, Thomas Jenkins," she whispered. "And I love you, Violet Jenkins," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." Together they sat in the quiet darkness, surrounded by the sounds of their ranch cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the occasional nicker of horses in the barn. Sounds of home. Sounds of a life built on love that had begun with the simple offering of bread to a woman starving beside the road.